Colonel David Carter, a decorated Army officer, entered the airport, carrying the remains of a fallen soldier. The weight of this duty was heavier than usual. Today was different. His polished dress shoes clicked sharply against the tile floor, cutting through the typical airport chaos. Families pulled rolling suitcases, business travelers were glued to their phones, and children darted ahead of their tired parents. It was the usual scene, a symphony of noise and movement, but for Carter, everything felt unusually heavy. He had been through this routine countless times before, but today he was not just another officer walking through the airport. Today he was carrying Private First Class Jason Reynolds' remains, just 21 years old, gone too soon. The young soldier's casket lay waiting on the tarmac, draped in the American flag. Colonel Carter adjusted his hat, taking a deep breath as he steadied himself for the journey ahead. The weight on his chest wasn't just from the medals and ribbons adorning his uniform, but from the heavy responsibility that came with this solemn mission. He wasn't just representing himself, he was fulfilling a promise made to every soldier who never made it home. No one gets left behind. Carter approached the airline counter with military orders in hand, his ID ready for inspection. The woman behind the desk barely glanced up as she typed something into the computer, her expression neutral. Then her fingers paused. Her eyes flickered up to meet his, hesitation evident in her expression. She blinked, taking a breath, and after what felt like an eternity she asked, "Sir, may I see that again?" Her voice was tight, and Carter noticed the subtle shift in her posture. She wasn't prepared for this, he could tell. He handed over the papers once more, watching her every movement closely. There was the briefest glance at her coworker, a silent communication that spoke volumes. She whispered something to another agent, his expression unreadable. Carter stood still, waiting. The moment stretched uncomfortably. He had seen this before, people faltering under pressure trying to avoid difficult questions. But this situation wasn't something Carter was willing to overlook. When the woman returned, her smile was forced, apologetic, but not sincere. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. We can't allow you to board at this time." Carter exhaled slowly, keeping his emotions in check. He had dealt with much more challenging situations before: combat zones, foreign diplomacy, political entanglements. But this was different. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," he stated evenly, tapping his military paperwork. "Everything is in order." The agent didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she glanced down at the computer screen, then back up at him with a strained expression. "I understand, sir, but there's a security protocol in place and we can't override it." "Security protocol?" Carter repeated, his voice steady but with an edge of confusion. "Yes, sir," she responded, forcing another weak smile. "It's just policy." Carter stood firm, refusing to budge. "Policy? What policy?" Behind him, the line of people was growing, murmuring quietly as they shifted. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. He wasn't leaving without an answer. His shoulders squared, his posture rigid with resolve. The airline staff, however, wasn't backing down. The atmosphere around the counter felt heavy, as whispers spread among the people in line. A man in a crisp military uniform, denied entry to a flight, wasn't a sight that many witnessed daily. The tension in the air thickened as Carter remained calm, his voice unwavering. "Ma'am, I need to understand exactly what the issue is," he insisted. "This is a military assignment, not a personal trip. My documentation is valid." The agent hesitated again, her eyes darting to her co-workers, whispering behind him. Finally, a supervisor, a man in his mid-50s with a weary expression, stepped forward. He adjusted his name tag and folded his arms, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his voice professional, as if trying to diffuse the situation. "But we have certain policies in place and unfortunately, we can't override them at this time." There it was again, policies. Carter inhaled slowly, his patience worn thin, but his demeanor calm. He had heard this excuse before, though in different contexts. He wasn't buying it. "I've flown with military escorts before," Carter said, his voice steady, suppressing any hint of frustration. "I know the procedure and I know there is no policy stopping me from boarding. So let's be honest here. What's the real reason I'm being denied?" The supervisor cleared his throat and shifted on his feet uncomfortably. "It's just an extra security measure," he replied, looking anywhere but Carter's eyes. "Nothing personal, sir." "Nothing personal?" Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his emotions in check. He had been in enough rooms where vague explanations were used to dodge the truth. He knew what they were doing. testing his patience, waiting for him to lose his temper. But Carter wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He wasn't about to let them win. The seconds ticked by, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Carter remained composed, standing tall, his voice unwavering. He would not be moved, not by their policies, not by their attempts to push him aside. His mission wasn't just about getting on a flight, it was about ensuring the final journey of a soldier was honored. And he would see that promise through no matter the obstacle. The people in line were watching now. A woman in a red blazer leaned in to whisper something to her husband. A young man holding his boarding pass frowned, glancing at the airline employees, as though trying to make sense of what was happening. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance?" Carter turned his head slightly. A man a few spots behind him in line had spoken up. He was older, probably in his mid-60s, with a weathered face and a USMC hat pulled low over his brow. A Marine. A veteran. The supervisor looked uncomfortable. "No, sir. This isn't about clearance. We just have to follow standard protocol." The Marine let out a sharp breath. "Yeah, I've been through security 1,000 times and I've never seen protocol stop a soldier from escorting one of our own home." He folded his arms. "So what is it?" Murmurs began to spread through the line. People started pulling out their phones, recording the growing tension. The shift in the air was palpable. The airline staff behind the counter could feel it too. The agent who had originally denied Carter stole a glance at her supervisor, looking unsure now. The supervisor sighed, rubbing a hand over his temple. He glanced at Carter again, the weight of the moment settling in. "Let me check something," he muttered before walking off. The agent at the counter kept her gaze down, suddenly very interested in her computer screen. Carter didn't move. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, staring straight ahead. He wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the story. The murmur in the terminal was no longer just background noise. It was focused, charged. People in line were no longer just waiting for their flights. They were watching. Recording. The Marine who had spoken up wasn't the only one looking irritated. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket, clutching her purse, shook her head and leaned toward her husband. "This isn't right," she muttered, her voice tinged with disbelief. A younger man in a hoodie pulled out his phone and started typing, his fingers moving quickly. People were taking notice, and that was dangerous for the airline. Carter kept his expression unreadable, but inside he was taking note of every detail. The supervisor still hadn't returned, which meant one of two things. He was either scrambling for an excuse or waiting for the situation to die down. Neither was going to happen. Then a voice came from behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Carter turned his head slightly. A young woman, no older than 25, was standing a few feet away, phone in hand. Her eyes were uncertain but determined. I don't mean to intrude, but I just want to make sure I understand," she began, her voice not loud but careful, deliberate. "They're not letting you board?" People nearby paid attention to her words. Carter exhaled, glancing at the agent behind the counter. "That's correct." The young woman blinked, as if she expected to hear a different answer. She hesitated for a second, then nodded once. She turned her phone screen toward him. "I'm live right now," she said. "People need to see this." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Another man held up his phone. "This is wrong," he said, shaking his head. "This man is literally escorting a fallen soldier." A woman further back raised her voice. "Hey, excuse me." She waved her hand toward the counter. "Can someone explain why he's being denied?" A few people shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether they should get involved. But the energy in the room had changed. What started as quiet murmurs had grown into something bigger, something the airline staff could no longer ignore. The agent behind the counter looked like she wanted to shrink into the floor. Her hands were frozen over the keyboard, her eyes flickering nervously to the camera lenses now pointed in her direction. Then the Marine from earlier took a step forward. He was done playing nice. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But I never thought I'd see the day when an American soldier, especially one escorting the remains of a brother in arms, was treated like this." The terminal had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual airport announcements over the speakers seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by the tension in the air. Every eye in the room was on them. The staff behind the counter could feel it too. The moment had shifted beyond their control. The pressure was mounting, the stakes higher than any security protocol could account for. People were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses to something much bigger. The sound in the terminal was distant, muted. The only noise was the steady beeping from phones capturing every second of what was unfolding. The Marine squared his shoulders, his voice firm. This is a disgrace. The agent swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she clicked nervously at her keyboard. The supervisor was still nowhere to be seen. Passengers whispered, and a baby fussed in its stroller, but the mother, instead of soothing the child, was glued to her phone, her face twisted in disgust. Then, somewhere in the back of the line, a man muttered, "It's already trending." Carter didn't move. He didn't need to. The world was watching now. The tension in the terminal was thick, and the airline staff was trapped in awkward silence. Phones were out, recording, tweeting, streaming, and then, like a spark hitting dry grass, it spread. The young man in the hoodie, still glued to his phone, let out a low whistle. Damn, this is everywhere now. Carter didn't react. He knew better than to celebrate too soon, but from the way the agent behind the counter stiffened, he could tell she knew it too. The woman in the denim jacket checked her phone and gasped, "Oh my God." She whispered to her husband, "It's already on Facebook." The older Marine grunted and pulled out his own phone. They don't even know what kind of storm they just started. Then, as if on cue, the airport's loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention passengers, due to unforeseen circumstances, Flight 237 to Phoenix will be delayed. We apologize for any inconvenience." A few groans rippled through the crowd, but most people weren't paying attention. Their focus was fixed on the uniformed soldier being denied his flight while carrying out his duty. A minute later, a young woman near the windows gasped, "He's on Twitter." She turned her screen toward the crowd and people leaned in. The tweet read in bold capital letters, "They just denied a black U.S. Army colonel his flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes. Hashtag let him fly." Underneath, the numbers were climbing. Retweets, comments, likes. It was catching fire. Then another tweet popped up, this one from a veteran advocacy group. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at airport name. Our soldiers deserve better. Expect action." The crowd murmured, the realization sinking in. The airline had officially lost control of the narrative. The agent behind the counter, still frozen in place, let out a shaky breath. She turned and hurried toward the back, disappearing behind a frosted glass door. She wasn't coming back with an answer, she was coming back with damage control. Carter adjusted his hat. He had been in situations like this before, though not at an airport and not quite like this, but in places where powerful people suddenly realized they had made the wrong enemy. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. At the end of the day, this wasn't about him. It was about Private First Class Jason Reynolds, the young man waiting to go home. And right now, that mission was still incomplete. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. The terminal felt different now, charged, expectant. Then the supervisor finally returned, but he wasn't alone. A second man walked beside him. This one wore a sleek navy suit, his airline ID clipped neatly to his pocket. His walk was brisk, controlled, like someone used to putting out fires. He stopped just short of the counter, scanning the scene. His eyes darted between Carter, the Marine, and the rows of phones still recording. He cleared his throat. "Colonel, I apologize for the miscommunication. There seems to have been an error with our system, but we're working to get you on your flight as soon as possible." Miscommunication. Carter had been in the military long enough to know exactly what that word meant. It meant we got caught. It meant we made a mistake and now we're scrambling to fix it. But Carter didn't speak. He just stood there, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. The damage was done and the eyes of the world were on them now. The airline could apologize, could offer damage control, but it was too late. The truth had already been shared, and nothing would erase what had happened here today. Fix this before it costs us too much. The airline rep didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the moment to hang in the air, watching as the silence pressed down on him. Carter stood firm, his gaze unwavering. After a few moments he finally spoke, his voice measured and steady. "I see. An error," the rep said quickly, trying to regain control. "Yes, sir, a regrettable mistake. We assure you it was not intentional." A few people in the crowd scoffed. The Marine, arms crossed, shook his head in disbelief. The airline rep adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable, before continuing. "We'd like to personally escort you to the gate now, Colonel. First-class accommodations, of course." First class. As if that were the point. Carter's gaze shifted past the rep to the counter, where the same agent who had denied him earlier still stood, looking anywhere but at him. The same agent who had given him a stiff smile when she refused his flight, who hadn't bothered to check the documentation before saying no. Carter exhaled slowly. I appreciate the urgency, he said evenly. But I need to clarify something. The rep nodded quickly. Of course. Carter's voice remained steady. If no one had recorded this, if no one had spoken up, would I still be standing here? A beat of silence. The rep swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, Carter interrupted, already knowing the answer. You don't need to answer, he said, his tone unwavering. Everyone in the terminal knew it. Another moment of silence passed, then a woman in the crowd murmured, He's right. The rep tried again to smooth over the growing tension. Sir, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. We both know this isn't about an apology, Carter said, his voice firm. It's about accountability. The crowd murmured in agreement. The anger had shifted to disappointment. The rep knew he was losing control. He straightened up, adopting a more authoritative stance. Colonel, let us get you on your flight now, he said, but before Carter could respond, a new voice interrupted. Sir, a younger man in an airport security uniform had appeared beside the counter, holding out a phone toward the airline rep. His expression was tight. I think you should see this. The rep frowned, taking the phone. He scrolled through the screen, his face paling as he did. The Marine, arms still crossed, narrowed his eyes. What? Something wrong? The rep didn't respond, but Carter could tell. He already knew. The backlash had exploded beyond the airport. A major news outlet had picked up the story. The headline was blunt. U.S. Army colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline scrambles for answers. Below it, a video clip from the terminal played, showing Carter's exchange with the airline staff. The rep handed the phone back, inhaling sharply before turning back to Carter. We deeply regret this situation, the rep said, his voice thinner now, forced. We'd like to issue a public statement clarifying. The crowd was already recording, and Carter didn't need another apology. He cut him off. The public already knows the truth. Silence. The rep pressed his lips together, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Carter looked out at the crowd, then turned back to the rep. I don't need first class. I don't need special treatment. I need respect. And so does the soldier I'm escorting. Another murmur ran through the crowd. The rep gave a stiff nod as if that was all he could do now. Understood, sir. The Marine let out a small approving grunt, and Carter adjusted his hat, his mind focused on the mission. Now let's finish this mission. But the consequences for the airline were just beginning. The airline had lost control of the situation. The story was out, and it was spreading faster than they could contain it. The terminal now felt more like a press conference, with phones still recording and passengers still watching. Then something unexpected happened. A man in a dark blue suit, with the unmistakable posture of someone with real authority, stepped into the scene. He wasn't from the airline, and he wasn't airport security. He was military. The room shifted. People instinctively moved aside as the man approached. His ID badge flashed briefly as he stepped up to Carter and extended his hand. Colonel, he said firmly, I'm Major Thomas Beckett, Department of the Army. We've been informed of the situation. Carter shook his hand, his grip strong. He didn't need to ask how the major had gotten there so quickly. The military doesn't play when it comes to its own. Beckett turned to the airline rep, his voice crisp. We are handling this now. Colonel Carter and the remains of Private First Class Reynolds will not be flying commercial. The rep blinked. Sir, we were just about to. You were just about to cover your tracks, Beckett interrupted, his tone polite but carrying undeniable weight. He glanced at Carter. Sir, the Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight. The rep's face went white. The situation had gone from a public relations disaster to a full-scale military intervention in the blink of an eye. He could no longer hide from the reality of his mistake. Your transport is waiting. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances, realizing the U.S. military had stepped in. Carter exhaled, not out of relief he didn't need saving but because the mission was finally back on course. He gave a small nod. Understood. Major Beckett's gaze flicked toward the airline rep one last time. This will be addressed. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Carter turned back to the Marine, who had been watching the entire exchange with satisfaction. Appreciate you, brother, Carter said. The Marine tipped his head. We look out for our own. Carter gave the room one last glance. The people who had spoken up, who had refused to let this slide, who had made sure the story was heard. He adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders and walked out, not toward the gate but toward something bigger. For the airline, the fallout had just begun. The airline thought the situation would fade away after a few apologies, a press release, maybe a statement from their CEO. Damage control. But the public wasn't letting this go. News networks picked up the story, veteran organizations released statements condemning the airline's actions, and politicians demanded accountability. Then came the financial hit. By the end of the week, the airline stock had dropped. A trending hashtag calling for a boycott gained traction, with customers flooding social media demanding answers. And then the final blow, a lawsuit. A coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal complaint against the airline for discrimination and failure to uphold service member protections. Under pressure, the airline CEO made a public appearance. He called it a regrettable misunderstanding, and announced that the employees involved had been placed on administrative leave. Too little too late. Meanwhile, Colonel Carter continued his mission. He escorted Private First Class Jason Reynolds home, standing by as the young soldier's family received him for the last time. Carter didn't need the headlines. He didn't need the attention. He needed respect. And that was the real fight. Respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't require a viral video or public outrage. It should be the standard. The people at that airport, the Marine, the passengers who spoke up, the ones who refused to stay silent, proved something important. When people stand together, justice has nowhere to hide. If you believe in accountability, if you believe in honoring those who serve, let your voice be heard. Because silence lets things like this happen again, and next time, it might not go viral.